And I'm delighted that you are all here in such large numbers for this second session. The idea of the research dialogues is that scholars who work on projects closely related to the research teams and research areas of the KNIR present work in progress and engage in a stimulating and fruitful discussion, a dialogue indeed, with the audience. Due to the pandemic, of course, we are still online, unfortunately, but we hope to be able to move to a hybrid format with a live speaker and a live audience and also a live video transmission in a not too distant future. So today is the second session, as I mentioned, that we have planned until the summer. And I think we have a very interesting program for this semester. So I invite everyone to check out our upcoming sessions on our website and subscribe to our newsletter if you have not already done so. One technical thing, all the cameras will be turned off during the presentation. And for the discussion part, everyone's video will be enabled. And you are also encouraged to turn it on, especially of course, if you have a question or a remark. And now I would like to give the word to our Director of Studies in History and also the scientific organizer of this session, Dr. Maria Bonaria Urban, to introduce our two speakers of today. Maria.
Thank you very much, Matthijs. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this second research dialogue, which promised to be as exciting as the previous one. First of all, I would like to thank the two speakers of today, Professor Chiara De Cesari and Dr. Aria Spinelli, to have kindly accepted our invitation. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to welcome you today. Matthijs has already said something about the program of today, but maybe it's important to say that the presentation, we will start with the presentation, which will last, I suppose, 30-35 minutes. And after the presentation, we will open the question and answer. So you can pose your question, and please, you can use the option, the bottom on the screen below on the bar on the right, and you can choose the option raise hand. And I will invite you to pose the question after that. And if you don't see the bottom, just in case you don't see the bottom, you can also write your question in the chat. And we will move through all the questions in this way. And now I'm very pleased to introduce the two speakers. Professor Chiara De Cesari is Associate Professor in European and Cultural Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And she's making an exceptional contribution to the culture and memory studies. Her research explores how forms of memory, heritage, art, and cultural politics are shifting under conditions of contemporary globalization and state transformation. And today, our talk with Dr. Aria Spinelli will focus on their current Dutch Research Council funded project on this theme. Another important topic of Professor De Cesari research concerns the transnational politics of memory and cultural heritage. Her monograph, Heritage and the Cultural Struggle for Palestine, was published by Stanford University Press 2 years ago. And a third important research topic focuses on colonial legacies in contemporary Europe. And Chiara is currently co-writing another monograph on this topic, which explores how museums are reframing colonial histories in response to post-colonial critiques. Across these interests, Chiara has published many articles in leading journals, such as The American Anthropologist, Current Anthropology, and Memory Study. And I want to highlight two key volumes in memory studies that she co-edited in recent years. The first, European Memory in Populism, published 2 years ago, and before Transnational Memory in 2014. Finally, she's also involved in several international and interdisciplinary collaboration and projects. I'd like to highlight that she's currently working on the project funded by the Humanities in European Research Area, and another major project financed by the Dutch Research Council and the Dutch Research Agenda on colonial heritage in museums. And now I'll move on to introduce our second guest of today, Dr. Aria Spinelli. She's an independent curator and a postdoc researcher at the University of Amsterdam. Her research focuses on the interplay between art, activism, and political theory. Her PhD analyzed relations of curatorial practice to social imagination and performativity. And Aria holds a bachelor and master's degree in art history, visual art, and curatorial studies. She is a founding member of the artistic and curatorial collective Radical Intention. And between 2018 and 2020, she was also associate researcher and member of the curatorial team of the project, The Independent, at the MAXI, so the Museum of the 21st Century for Art in Rome. She also collaborated as external curator at several foundations, such as the Pistoletto Foundation in Biella, the Isol Art Center in Milan, and last and certainly not least, the Beaux-Arts Center for Fine Arts in Brussels. She's published many articles, and she's the editor of the publication Shaping Desired Futures in 2018. So I think it's time to move on, and we are here really eager to learn more about this project. And so I'm very pleased to hand over to our guest. So Chiara and Aria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the kind introduction, and thank you and the whole KNIR director and the whole staff for this very kind invitation. I have been already a guest, and I really like to be at the KNIR also, even though now we can only be virtually together. Well, buon pomeriggio, good afternoon. Aria and I are very, very glad to present you in front of you today the beginning, actually, of our project on imagining institutions otherwise. Oh, sorry, let me first share a PowerPoint. Do you see it? No problem? Okay.
Perfect.
Yes, this is, as I said, we started the project a year ago, the IMAGINART project. And as I said, it's a collective project. It's funded by the NVO, and it involves Aria as well as two other researchers, Esther Zakax and Yazan Khalili, who are doing the Palestinian Lebanese case studies and the Hungarian case study, which I will shortly introduce later on. And we are working also very closely together with another project that we are doing together with Wayne Modest of the National Museum of World Cultures of the Netherlands, also partly funded by the NVO, which has been very generous with us. And we are collaborating particularly with two researchers of this project, Nouraini Giuliastuti and Karin Zaiman, who are looking into similar dimensions, but in Indonesia and in South Africa. So we are trying to explore similar issues, questions of creative institutionalism, art, and socio-institutional innovation in sort of a broad varieties of case studies in and beyond Europe. On the picture, you see a photo of the Teatro Valle, which many of you likely know, and which will be the topic of Aria's presentation. later on, and this is one of the key sites of our research. So the research originates in essentially a set of key empirical and theoretical concerns. Empirically, there has been the question of the relationship. Empirically, there is the question of the relationship between art and politics, and particularly what we have seen recently, namely that artistic practices have played a very important roles in different protests against state repression, state transformations in different parts of the world, more than in the past. And I want to remind you of, for example, the Arab revolutions and the role of the arts in that context, Occupy Wall Street, and the role of art and more broadly creative and artistic practices in these new forms of protests. On the other hand, there has been a series of important transformations within a globalized art world that have also moved art closer and closer to politics and to social movement. I'm talking particularly, well, first of all, of the globalization of the art world and the sort of expansion of the art world beyond sort of the traditional confine and spaces of art, like museums and art institutions in Europe and in the US. And on the other hand, there is the so-called social turn in art, which is, and particularly the emergence and proliferation of social practice art, by which I mean artistic practices that are no longer only representational, in the sense they not only aim to represent the social world, but these newer artistic practices actually intentionally aim at intervening and changing the social world. So no longer only representing the world, but also changing and intervening in it. And again, think of this development in connection with the increasing entanglements between art and different forms of politics, and particularly protest politics. At the level of theory, there is a little bit of a paradox, because on the one hand, state theory and theories of institutional innovation, mostly from sociology and political science, but also in anthropology, tend to completely neglect the arts and the contributions of particularly social practice art and what I called artists and cultural workers, creative and experimental institutionalism in processes of state and institutional transformation. So really for the vast majority of sociology and political scientists who study the state, the question of creative institutionalism and artists thinking new institutions is really not very important. At the same time, there is a lot of theorizing in art theory, of course, but also in political and critical theory. And I remind you of, for example, Rancière's, of people basically saying that that arts actually not only aim to change, to produce social change, but also achieve this social change. And again, I remind you of Jacques Rancière, but there are many artistic art theorists and political theorists more on the critical studies, critical theory side, saying essentially making this very normative argument that the new goal of art is to change, to change realities. At the same time, all these studies really have very little of empirical case studies and empirical confirmation, because they are in general very abstract arguments about the role of art in social change. And so we are all interested in the question of, okay, if sort of art does contribute, well, first of all, does art contribute to social and institutional change? And if so, how does it do so in the actual sort of concrete practice of movements and spaces? So how is it true that this artist experimentation and creative institutionalism does change not only the way we think about institutions and about the state, but also about how they work in practice? I started thinking about this issue. Of course, I started thinking about this issue in the by way of my work in Palestine, and particularly in the Palestinian territories and in Ramallah, which has experienced a kind of cultural boom in recent years, in the past, particularly in the past 15 years, of all kinds of cultural and arts organizations proliferating in the West Bank, and particularly in the area of Ramallah. Some are more institutionalized, and they are all non-state institutions, so they are not related to the Palestinian Authority. They are mostly NGO-like organizations, including the museum that you see in the picture. This is the Palestinian Museum that was inaugurated a few years ago, and which is sponsored by a major Palestinian NGO. This is another sort of institution created originally by artists and cultural producers and cultural workers in Ramallah. This is the Palestinian Art Academy, which was initiated as an itinerant artist workshop, and by which a number of Palestinian artists were doing workshops, art workshops and art training with children around the West Bank. And then it slowly became first an informal civil society in institutions, granting art degrees by way of, through a partnership with the Norwegian Academy of Art. And now it's slowly institutionalizing by way of a partnership with the main Palestinian university in 𝐕𝐳𝐬𝐻, in very close to Ramallah, so that the Palestinian Art Academy is now a full faculty of 𝐕𝐳𝐬𝐻 University. And here you can see sort of this transition from a very grassroots project to an institutional one. I don't know why my presentation is going forward without me clicking on it. It's a bit strange. Anyway, I just wanted to also connect this Palestinian cultural, sort of grassroots cultural organizing, slowly becoming institutionalized, with the Teatro Valle in Rome, which, as many of you, which I won't talk too much about it because Aria will do later on, but I just wanted to remind you in relation to the Palestinian Art Academy and the Palestinian cultural organizations, that also in the case of the Teatro Valle, you see this sort of grassroots organizing by particularly artists and cultural workers, creating spaces for thinking the political otherwise, arguably, which slowly become institutionalized in interesting and complex ways. But the Teatro Valle became a foundation for the common, and the first such foundation recognized by Italian law. And Aria will talk about these processes of institutionalization later on. So our main research question is then, how does art produce social change and institutional innovation? And the idea is to think about this question by way of very concrete case studies and stuff happening on the ground of artists and cultural workers establishing alternative institutions that become sort of, they start like the Palestinian Art Academy as very informal and workshops and grassroots organizations, and then slowly become bigger, and while remaining spaces for experimenting with forms of institutions and forms of commoning. So one of the common features of all our projects is this really strong focus on concrete case studies, concrete developments on the ground. So an ethnographic approach to theorizing this relationship between art and social change, particularly, vis-a-vis the theories that we have at the moment, which are available to think about those issues, which are extremely normative and abstract. In short, so our approach focuses on shifts a little bit the attention from the relationship between art and protest politics, which has been the focus of a lot of literature. Again, think about the Arab revolutions and Occupy Wall Street, to a focus on the relationship between institutions and sort of artist institutions or microtopias. These are social experiments by artists, these are technical terms, and the state, and the ways in which sort of they negotiate this complex relationship by different forms of institutionalization. And we do this by way of through, working together on a variety of different case studies. Italy, Aria's project on the Teatro Valle and other organizations. Then there is a project on Hungary, a project on the Palestinian territories and Lebanon, which are carried out by Esther Zsakaks and Yazan Khalili. And then we have our two colleagues, Nuraini Julia Stuti and Karin Zaiman, working on Indonesia and South Africa. And also an additional case studies are the transnational networks and platforms and institutions like biennials, which connects this interconnected sort of art world, worlds of arts and politics. And the idea is that sort of the broader, the concept is to look at the relationship between art, social practice, art and social change in the context of different forms of state transformation, sort of neoliberal policy making and reforms in Italy, and also in post-socialist state transformation in Hungary, and post-colonial state transformation, post-colonial / neoliberal state transformation in places like Indonesia and South Africa. Just a couple of slides of the other case studies before I leave the floor to Aria. This is a picture of, in Hungary, there is a different situation. If in places like Italy, and like the Palestinian territories, you have complex forms of engagements between sort of the state and the grassroots and civil societies, cultural organizations. In places like Hungary, so there are different forms of engagements or cultural organization engaging the states and negotiating their relationship with the state in different ways. While in Budapest, they're mostly independent cultural organizations, which are actually and intentionally disengaging from the state because they feel that the new sort of urban regime has completely hijacked and taken over the institutions of the state, and this doesn't leave space within those for artists and real cultural and political work to be done, and therefore they are completely detached, and they create alternative institutions which run parallel and which are funded completely sort of beyond the state, like the biennial, which will take place actually in a couple of weeks. So check that if you are interested. It's going to be largely online. Ashkal Alwan, it's a very important, in Lebanon, there is this sort of landscape of cultural organization, cultural and arts organization, really interesting, again, completely beyond the infrastructure of what is an essentially failed Lebanese state. And these organizations have grown throughout the post-war years to become, again, state-like institutions in the way in which they work, and also in their role, in their scope, and in their national role as national cultural institutions. This is a very important one in Beirut, Ashkal Alwan. Again, this is the Palestinian biennial, which is interesting because it's a biennial. Usually biennials are organized by the state or by city institutions. In the Palestinian case, is a network of civil society organizations which have produced which have produced and organized the local biennial, which is, again, in other cases, it's a state institution. And in a place like the West Bank, we have a state made by civil society by way of these collaborations. So I end with a picture of the Teatro Valle, so as to transition to Aria's presentation about it. And just before I leave the floor to her, I just wanted to sort of summarize what I said and to offer a couple of reflections for the discussion that we'll have at the end, suggesting these themes that run through our work and all our projects everywhere in the world, in the various cases that we look at. And there is, on the one hand, this theme of, and this interest in looking as into art as a site of institutional innovation, and also as a true mode of the political imagination beyond the West, which is usually the focus of this kind of research. Most research on art and politics is usually located in Europe and the US, or recently there is more on the Arab revolutions, but still sort of the focus of most research is rather Eurocentric. And we want to try to look into this sort of global landscape of alternative cultural organizing and rethinking of institutions and political platforms by way of art. And the other theme is this idea of looking at cultural policy and institutional innovation from a cultural and art studies perspective. And by connecting work in art on institutional critique, commoning with more traditional political science and sociology understanding of social change and institutional innovation. And on this note, I leave the floor to Aria, and I'll stop sharing my presentation now.
So hello, everyone. And I wanted to thank Chiara for the introduction, and I wanted to thank KNIR for hosting us both today, the staff and directorship. And I also have a presentation that I will share with you. I wanted to just give you a general introduction on actually where I'm coming from as a researcher, and how that will develop then in my presentation. So I have a curatorial background, and I was working as an independent curator. I've been working as an independent curator for the past 10 years. And, but I've also been very much interested in activist practice. I've been an activist myself, and I was involved personally also in a series of social movements or political movements that locally moved around the area, especially of Milan. And that was, one of them was Macau. That was a sort of a backlash of what Teatro Valle was trying to make in Rome. And so my interest as a researcher then lie in how do we connect this idea of art making or artistic practice and social movements, but especially when it comes to spaces and how those spaces are organized, and what type of collective work is behind them, and which kind of processes of commoning can actually change our perception of the ways we not only share, but also produce culture and arts. So starting from that question, I'll share my screen as well. I don't have many slides. It's just to give you a general introduction. And I'll try to put it on. I'm having problems in trying to create a view, but that's fine. Oh, here we go. So the Teatro Valle Occupato, I think, is a very unique example of what is called an occupied space, or rather, there's a long tradition of political movements that come to occupy then spaces in Italy. It goes back to the 1970s. They're called self-managed centers or autonomous self-managed centers. But the Teatro Valle was very much connected to the context and to the times also in which the workers decided to take over the theater. I think there are two major factors that actually worked into then the decision to take over the theater. One was the actually interesting absence of a proper Occupy movement in Italy, as we understood it, as we've seen in the examples in the US, but also in the Arab Spring. There are amongst the other theorists that have tried to explain the reason why there was no Occupy movement, or as we can call it in Italy. Federico Zampini is a researcher who is based in Switzerland, and he proposed that that the Occupy movement was actually the space to rethink the Occupy movement in Italy was actually taken over by the Five-Star Movement. And that's actually an interesting research proposal. So there were a series of actions and political movements, small political movements that were responding to the global call of the Occupy movement. And one of them was also the revisiting the commons, or this desire to revisit the commons. And in 2011, there was an important public referendum that came out about water, public water. And the Italian citizens were called to decide whether water systems and the distribution of drinking water should remain public or could be privatized. And the sort of the no against privatization won. But behind that text and behind the whole process to make it a referendum, there was one very important scholar who was 𝐕𝐵𝐺𝐻𝐻, and he's a jurist, and he teaches at the University of Turin. And he played a key role in the sort of the fight for public, maintaining our water resources public, but he also was a key figure at the Teatro Valle Occupato. So when the Teatro Valle decided to close for absence of funding, a lot of the people who were working within the theater, either as actors or technicians or as organizers, then protested against its closure, asking to revisit collectively the programming. And the discussion with the board went on for a while. And at the end, the group of people who were largely connected to Teatro Valle Occupato decided to take over the spaces. But it was the interesting thing was that at the point of the occupation of the theater, then they wrote a manifesto in which they were actually connecting a lot of what they were doing and a lot of what they desired to do within the theater to the idea of the commons. And so they had already started an informal discussion with 𝐈𝐦𝐚𝐺𝐬 on how to create an institution of the commons from below within the theater. And that was happening also in the city. It was happening with Cinema Palazzo in San Lorenzo, but it was also happening, very similar actions like these were happening a little bit all over Italy, to the point where the various peoples who were involved decided to call themselves fighting theaters. So the space of the theater was supposed to not only be occupied, but to become a new space of cultural experimentation. Now, the interesting thing about the Teatro Valle is that they use cultural programming as one of their main outputs for their political fight. And the way they used that was offering cultural programming that would go on for almost 10 hours a day. And it was free of charge, and it was inclusive and participative. And as a participant to the cultural programming, you could also become a participant to the General Assembly. And so they were getting more and more visibility in the course of their occupation. One of the general debates that came up from this use of cultural programming as a political, let's say, or an activist strategy was the idea that culture was of the many, and culture was supposed to be open, inclusive, and it was supposed to also be participative. And that's when 𝐈𝐦𝐚𝐺𝐬 started to connect the dots, let's say, between his background and his research on the commons. And he proposed then to turn the Teatro Valle into a foundation for the commons, the first foundation for the commons that the Italian legislation has actually seen. And the way he did that is through a commission that was set up by Stefano Rodotà, and who is another very famous jurist. And the commission was set up in 2007. It's called Commission Rodotà, and it was set up specifically to try to transform the idea or the concept of public good into a common good, so it could be self-managed. And it's through the commission that then collectively the group who was actually still occupying the theater at that time wrote the first manifesto of the Commons for Culture. And that was the basis of the text that then was used to set up the foundation. And the foundation was set up just before the space was actually evicted by the city of Rome. And but the interesting thing is that the group continued to work collectively, and they are continuing to participate in different kinds of events and festivals all around Italy. And they present themselves as a foundation for the commons. Now, when there was this interest of Mattei to turn Teatro Valle into the foundation of the commons, the question of what is culture as a commons came up. And I think it's still, maybe we can have a debate along these lines later on. I think it's still quite complicated, and it's an expression of the complexity that Chiara was talking about before. As we know, the occupied spaces are illegal, and so a lot of the spaces that are opened are supposed to be evicted quite quickly, but that is not always the case. And a lot of the spaces in Rome that are still occupied illegally have very strong connections with the city council and with its members, and very strong connection with associations or different kind of legal entities, let's say, in their neighborhoods. And so when we talk about Hungary, you can see the very precise and very, there's a huge difference between the way we conceive relationships to institutionalization in Italy and relationships to the state in Italy rather than Hungary. It's a more complex relationship because it's based on a mutual actually compromise and a constant dialogue on what could be possibly included and what could not be included. In the case of the Teatro Valle, it became even more complex given the fact that the group had decided that they want to be legalized. That obviously created a lot of discussion amongst other spaces who maintained their illegality as a sort of ideological status in which they wanted to stay. And but then on the other side, it also created a precedent on how we should consider a foundation for the commons for culture, which still has not been picked up within the art sector, but it's a case study that should be looked into a little bit more. Mattei moved on from Teatro Valle and he set up another foundation for the commons for public water in Naples. And currently the foundation is bringing drinking water to 1 million people in the city, and it's self-managed. But even the use of the term self-managed is still questionable. And so maybe we can look at that in later on. Another aspect which is quite interesting was the fact that there was an engagement with local institutions and art institutions in particular at the time of the occupation of the Valle between members of Valle Occupato and curators at either Maxi or Nomos Foundation or other important institutions. And a lot of the theaters and the occupants of the Teatro Valle participated in the production of artworks that then were showed within the museums. So that's also another quite complex, let's say, relationship that was defined at the time of the occupation of the Valle. And I wanted to show you a couple of examples that I find quite interesting. So the first example is a performance that took place in 2013, and it was based on a collaboration between Luigi Coppola and Marzia Migliora, two Italian artists that work with performance-based work. And what was asked, they set up an open call to what they called cittadinanza attiva, so the active part of citizenship in the city. And they decided to ask people to come into the theater and to participate in an assembly by using these hats that were made out of newspapers, and everybody could make their own. And that's why the actual title of the piece was called Io in testa. It's I in my own head, because the newspapers were actually an expression and of each person's identity based on different kind of events from the newspapers that they picked up. But then the assembly actually took place within the spaces of the Valle, as we have seen before. And within that assembly, they were supposed to define what they thought culture and collaboration could be. So it was a sort of inspired, the performance was inspired by what was actually happening within the spaces of the Valle. And their intention as artists was also to bring a larger public to think of and participate in this type of discussion. Another piece that was quite interesting was Marcia Migliora's Capienza Massima -1. So full capacity -1. And the idea behind the title is that she wanted to occupy the spaces of the entrance to the Maxi as much as possible, but there's always one person who's on the other side that then decides to participate in the performance. And the performance consisted in, I think it was a full day's occupation of the entrance. So not letting the visitors of the museum walk in, but to participate, you had to bring your own t-shirt. And on that t-shirt, you had to write what you thought occupation actually meant. And so you can see a photo on the right of a young student who made her own t-shirt and explained what she thought occupation was. And she says the space that everybody occupies, either separately or united, is still a space that has one unique meaning. So it's still a space of unity. And the third piece is Clemens von der Meyer, and he is a conceptual and video maker based in Berlin. And the interesting thing is that he decided to collaborate with the actors who were occupied in the spaces at Teatro Valle. And he created a 15-minute video on the idea of a procession and revisiting the histories of the ways people protested and demonstrated and within the streets. And so all three cases saw the involvement of the occupants of the Teatro Valle. And all three spaces included a production fee and a fee for performers as well, that were paid through, at one point were also paid through the foundation. So when the foundation was actually set up, then it received donations from these different institutions in order to then receive a fee, which is also a quite important aspect. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions that I'm actually asking myself once. In these three cases, I think the complexity of this institutional relationship between what has been called also alter institutions or creative institutions, or also independent but also autonomous institutions, and the local entities, so the city council or other museums, is quite complex. It's still, so how do we understand a legalized space and their actual relation with other institutions in the city? And then the other aspect is art actually a motor of social change? In these cases, the interesting thing is not about the output of the actual artwork, but it was about how the artworks were produced, were made, and were thought of within the process. And then finally is this idea of commoning. I mean, if we were to look at the manifest of the commons that that Mattei wrote in 2009, then he defines the commons as a participative space that works against the privatization of neoliberal capitalism. But then I think the processes of commoning, once we accepted these terms, once we accepted this notion of the commons, also involve relationships to the state that could be quite complex. And so it's still a nuanced understanding of how we move towards a different way of self-management. And finally, how does art play a role in this sense of commoning within the city? As you saw, Teatro Valle represented a reference point for artists and art institutions for the time that it was occupied, and became part of the city's ecology of spaces, of art spaces that were working at the time with no difference. There was a horizontal structure, there was a horizontal collaboration between them. So how do we define these type of politics? How do we define these type of institutions? And I'll leave you to that, and maybe we can start a discussion. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chiara and Aria, for your inspiring talk. I'm sure that your presentation has triggered our audience curiosity. So now we can open a discussion. So I would invite everyone, or those who want to pose a question, to use the bottom raise hand, and otherwise to write a question in the chat, so that we can immediately start with other discussion. And let's see if someone, otherwise I will start with the first question. Oh yes, I see immediately a hand. Yeah, that's Loredana Polezzi.
Okay, I think I have unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. You please, can you switch on your camera if you?
I can't at present.
Oh, you can.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You have to reauthorize us, I think. So at present I can't. But anyway, I can start asking the question.
Yes, of course. Thank
you. So that was okay. Asked me to start my video. Here we go. I have started my video. So thank you. That was fascinating, and it made me think of 100 different things. But I have two questions, and I suppose one is wider, and it's about any of the cases in your project, really. And it's this question of the connection between the art forms that you're talking about and space. The common trait of so many, and I don't know if it is true of all of the cases that you're looking at, but so many of these cases, is that they inhabit urban spaces. And so it's the urban nature of these relationships, I suppose, that I would like to ask you about, and how that plays out in different locations and in the different contexts that you have spoken about. Next to that, for me, there's the question of language. So just as there is space, and there's the question of the commonality or the sharing of that space, but then there's the question of how language or languages are allowed or are encouraged in these spaces. And so I'm interested and intrigued by what role multiple languages play in this. And I'll stop there, because as I said, I would have 100 other questions, but maybe I'll stop at that.
Can I ask you to specify sort of what you mean by language, in the sense that I could read it in several different ways?
Well, by all means do. Please read it in whatever way. But I was thinking about how much these spaces then become also multilingual spaces, or whether, for instance, they remain, again, the relationship with the institution passes through space, very often passes through legal status, but it also passes through the adoption, the making visible or the making invisible, deminoritizing or the not minoritizing of multiple languages, for instance. So if I think of the spaces in Rome, to what extent do these spaces then allow the visibility of the multilingualism that is characteristic of again, I return to the question of spaces. Urban spaces today are, and maybe in the past as well, and and not only urban spaces, but are inherently and strongly multilingual. So is that multilingualism made visible in this, or is it not? And that has its own issues of inclusivity, of commonality, and so on. So that's how I was thinking about it, but by all means, take it in any direction.
Maybe, Arya, I can say something about the language, and you say something about space, given that, because I think in a way it's certainly, I mean, concerning the space question, I think it's best if Arya answers in relation to the specific case of Rome, because certainly you are fully right. The urban dimension is in most cases very prominent, except for, it's interesting, in Indonesia, where a few of the commons museums that Nurain is looking into are, a few of them are actually agricultural or like rural projects. And they have to do with, these museums and these projects are very strongly connected to the question of the environment and the fight against extractivism and the devastation of the local environment. I would say, but this is really very interesting, is a very interesting issue, because I think that's the only case, and in the all other, and it's because of this particular relation with the politics of the environmentalist fight. Well, and also the fight against enclosure.
Sort of come in there, because I was thinking as you were speaking, obviously, and as an Italian, I was thinking, for instance, of other movements in Italy, other protest movements that have that kind of grassroots element. And the obvious case that was bringing to mind was the no-TAV movement. But to what extent, I mean, Henri De Lucas had a very notorious, notable in sort of interaction with the no-TAV movement, which is more environmentally related, and so it's outside the city. But I can't think of art as in visual art or performance art in the same way. So that's what was going through my mind as well there.
Okay. Thank you. It's really interesting. I have to say, you're fully right. It's also, I mean, it's one of the most important protest movement in Italy in recent years, and yet I haven't thought of it, and I'm not sure what's Aria's approach here, but I haven't thought of it, and I think it's because it's actually not very related to sort of artistic practices, forms of artistic protests. While all the other ones, I mean, our cases, of course, we pick them and because of that very strong connection. So, but I think that if in the case of the commons, I would say, maybe through Mattei, maybe it's also the chance of history that in the case, kind of in the case of the fight for the commons in Italy, there was this strong connection with sort of artistic practices and cultural production through the Teatro Valle experiments, and perhaps through people like Mattei and his role in the process, while it was not the case for the no-TAV. I have to say, I don't know it too well, but I don't think there is that connection. But indeed, I mean, they're very, like all the Europeans ones are very strongly connected to specific cities, and they are very site and city specifics as experiments. And before maybe I leave Arias to answer the question, I wanted to say that multilingualism is something that I hadn't thought of at the beginning of the project. Now I'm more and more, I have to say, I'm personally more and more concerned with the issue, because I think it's a central, I mean, it's a central sort of, in a way, it's a political fight to produce and inhabit more multilingual spaces, also because, we are multilingual. Thank you for the really lovely questions. And
yeah, I just wanted to add the fact that we, together with Chiara, we decided to focus, given the time also, maybe I went a little bit over time as well, but to focus on Teatro Valle. But then Rome, my research in the upcoming years will be on the city of Rome. So I will be looking into different kinds of spaces across the city, and there are a couple of spaces that are dealing with, let's say, multiculturalism rather than multilingualism. And there are a couple of them as well that come from the grassroots movements of the 70s that are very much connected to the agricultural scene. And so there's a huge discussion on food resource, and especially today in a post-pandemic world, where at the end of the, I mean, it was interesting because a lot of the spaces gave kind of put aside their cultural programming to participate in different kind of food banks and distribution of food within the city. So that's something that that also kind of reflects on this idea of commoning and where does the common lie. And then no TAV is definitely not the case, because there are not many artists participated in the fight. I think it was because it was very localized and very centralized on a very specific kind of fight. But then at the same time, there are a lot of artists who participated and tried to set up spaces themselves dealing with organic agriculture. It's kind of become a trend in the last let's say in the last 4 or 5 years. And Luigi Coppola, who participated, that I showed the slide of in kind of the Teatro Valle, he authored and initiated a self-managed bakery in the southern part of Italy that now is working on its own. And there's a whole discussion on bank seeds, and so there's a lot going on in the arts specifically, and there are a lot of artists that are looking into rural contexts as well. But my research will there's a rural context in Rome that would be interesting to investigate on its own, but we'll see how that develops.
Thank you for the answer.
Yeah, thanks from me too.
We have still 2 questions, so we have a few minutes. So the first person who asked to pose the question was Luisa Bialasevic, and then was the question of Lori Kalb-Cosmo. So maybe Luisa, can you start? Please?
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, Chiara and Aria, for this wonderful presentation. I would have tons of questions, but I'll restrain myself to one, and actually follow up on what Loredana was asking you, because as a geographer, as some of you all know, of course I'm going to ask you about space and the difference that space makes, and I was going to ask you what difference do cities make, because I think it's interesting, Loredana, that you asked that, because I think to me, commoning is kind of inherently linked to the city, which is, maybe because the movement, whether in Teatro Valle or other similar movements, were so strongly inspired by the right to the city literature. I mean, David Harvey actually, made an appearance in the Teatro Valle. So, I see that as such a, close tie. But of course, that's not necessarily so. And, so I wonder to what degree also these practices, these interventions in the Italian context are drawing on a much longer standing series of political practices, whether the autonomous movements, squatting movements, and so on. So I think, it would be strange to to think of it, but maybe it actually does make sense to look at the the literature on policy mobilities, on activist mobilities, and how places learn from each other, and how things come full circle, where the Occupy movement was learning from Italy, from some of these, practices of the 1970s and 80s, and now it's through Occupy, it's come back. So maybe something to think about. But the question I really wanted to ask you was about how different places make a difference, because, you were describing, apart from Rome, other sites that are part of the project. And what I was wondering is, how can we compare a situation like Orban's Hungary to Italy, for example, where the institutional context, the political setting is so different. Certainly in the case of Hungary, these parallel spaces and the institutions animating them, including, NGOs, artists' organizations, are being labeled as foreign agents, as, kind of incursions of, anything from foreign funders to, kind of for a foreign presence. And so I wonder how in the project you're also dealing with that, kind of thinking really of very different institutional contexts that structure the realm of possibility for these sorts of initiatives. But I'll stop there because as I said, I'd have a million other questions, but I think I've kind of thrown enough there.
Chiara?
I'll just go.
Start?
I'll start and then you'll continue. I think what we should take into consideration maybe in the discussion of space is also the art space, or the space dedicated to the arts, and in some ways also language issues, or that this discourse could be connected to the notion of language as well. So how the languages of art then work within political sphere. The urban concept definitely defines a lot of the experiences that I've been looking at, and that I would like to look at also in the future of my research, given the highly complex political context of the urban in itself, and in particular Rome. But then on the other hand, the project is invested, at least my project is contributing to a transnational discourse on the art's role within creative institutionalism. And we have discussed about how we can think of more generally institutionalism and how it's then developed within these spaces, and how creativity is actually connected to that. And so in my case, it's going to be a real chance. It's going to be a real opportunity for me personally to broaden the critical discourse around art and politics within a transnational context, because that never happens. Italy is always the exception, and it's always too specific to participate in more general discussions about art and politics. And then I think that there's a globalized and international art discourse that has defined ways of making art, and ways of also distributing art that are quite similar all over the world, given the globalized, given the actual network of art is globalized. And so there are a lot of commonalities in the way art institutions see themselves in Hungary and in Italy. And we have discussed this, but maybe Chiara can pick up on this as well. We've discussed this with Esther specifically, because there is an international discourse and a local discourse, and there are a lot of connections between the two in Hungary and in Italy, and they play out in the same way. So that's very interesting.
Sorry.
You wanted to say something?
No. I
just wanted to really thank you, Louisa, for the lovely question. And I mean, I can only answer in part also because we have started. We have actually, let's say, just started. In fact, it's a year, but we are sort of still at the stage of figuring out how we work as a group, and figuring out our tools, our sort of theoretical points of references, our language, and our shared languages and our methods. So in a way, this is still almost, what we are presenting to you today is still very much kind of a project proposal, because a lot of the research we still have to do it, and a lot of the field work we still have to do. But certainly one of the key issues is the question of the sort of the spatial and temporal connections. So in a way, the sort of the geography and history of the projects we are talking about is really one of the sort of one of our major concerns, in the sense that we are trying to our aim is to imagine and think along a complex notion of overlapping and intersecting and interrelated geography, in the sense that, first of all, I think certainly there all these projects have, first of all, very complex local and cosmopolitan genealogies. So it's really interesting right now, we are talking about the various connection. Of course, the Italian experience, the autonomous thinking in the 70s, also the experiences on the ground in the 70s, but also, Indonesia, and way back before that, of course, the question of Palestine, South Africa, all kinds of Hungary, the relationship between artists and the artist and the socialist state, and artists creating a parallel world already then. So there are all these projects, are very complex genealogies that are at the same time, they're both very localized and situated, and yet transnationally connected, also back then. Is not that they, and of course now they are very strongly interconnected. And, also the intellectuals, the artists of reference, the points of reference, the models are very similar. And many of these organizations are talking to each other, and they know each other, so they change. It's a bit like the policymakers, also the activists exchange best practices and talk a lot. So there is this element of looking at the genealogies as both situated and interconnected, and also looking at the interconnections now, while keeping a focus on the local and the very local histories, because again, there is no, it's no chance that the Teatro Valle was in Rome, because of the particular history, also Italian history of entanglement and dialogues between art and politics, at least ever since the 60s. So I think the question of, the cases are of course very different, and but they, of course, they have certain similarities, and the main similarity, the main common thread is, of course, is this landscape of cultural organizations and micro-utopias, proposing alternative models of institutions. But at the same time, I'm personally also really interested in the in the differences, and I conceive of it in terms of of course, particularly in terms of different forms of state transformations, which again have interconnection. So I think of art in relation to, neoliberal change, post-socialist, post-colonial, and up to the outwards failure of the state, like you have, for example, in Lebanon and of course in the West Bank. So I'm really interested, and I think we do have enough similarities to be able to compare these different case studies and really get an interesting understanding of how these interconnected projects happen in different places. And if I can say something, because I saw, Monica questions about the agora and connecting to something that Luisa was saying, I have to say that I have to admit that the the spatiality and the question of space in our projects is really a complex one, and I don't have a clear answer for you. I only think of it in many, the question of space figure in so many different ways in our projects, also because those are agoras in a way. Those are new type, it's like working out new types of agoras in different places, starting from very specific conditions. And it's also related to the ways in which, and I think this is something that is quite interesting of today, also in the Netherlands, the ways in which certain cultural spaces and cultural institutions are becoming or want to become new sort of kinds of democratic agoras. And that's also a sort of, there is the space of the agora, there is the space of the museum, and there is the, you know, other kinds of public spaces, mostly in the cities.
Thank you, Chiara. And we have still many questions. And I would like to ask Lori Kalb-Cosmo to pose her question, because she's waiting already a long time.
Sorry.
No. I means that Monica question arrived later. I see only different chats, and Lori wrote to me. That's the difference. So you didn't know. No one knows.
Thank you, Maria. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay. This was a really, really interesting talk. I'm an art and cultural historian, and I'm more accustomed to looking at artistic interventions within the museum walls. And I'm very interested in contemporary artists' responses to museums, particularly ethnographic museums. But as I was listening to Aria talk, I'm in Rome, and I was thinking about street art. And I was thinking in particular about the artist Blue, who insists on remaining anonymous, even though he's quite well known internationally. And I was thinking about his interventions, and I was thinking about occupation. And so he has made some really vibrant interventions on the facades of buildings that are occupied not by artists, but by squatters. And his interventions have drawn recognition to the buildings, in some instances, allowing those squatters to remain longer than they might have otherwise remained in the buildings. And he's done this, he's done this he's insisted, he's painted these buildings at night. He has refused, he doesn't sign his work, he's refused any kind of public recognition, but this practice has in a way also become institutionalized. And I'm thinking in particular of probably his most famous work on Via Porto del Fluviale, which now has another work of graffiti across the street, which was commissioned by architects for that building, and has a lot of it, is very ecological, that but it's institutional. It's recognized. Whereas Blue has insisted on this anonymity. And it just made me think about larger questions having to do with these kinds of occupation. And Aria's mention of this sort of Italy's very complicated relationship between occupation. Occupation is not only practiced with artists, it's practiced by students in high schools. It's just this phenomenon. But it made me think of, if I'm thinking about how Blue, the anonymous artist, created recognition for these buildings, it made me think about these issues of anonymity and the Foundation for the Commons, and how is the idea of anonymity negotiated with institutions. And so I guess, which are very public and which are not anonymous. So I'm rambling, but I'm kind of, this presentation made me think about those issues. So that's all.
Well, I think that Blue also took down or teared down one of his works in Bologna, one of his early works in Bologna, as an attack against the institutionalization of street art. And so we're talking about a very interesting case of art making. But definitely the piece at the Porto Fluviale helped the occupation to go on for longer. And I, as a sort of collaborator and activist at the Isola Art Center in Milan, which was a occupied community art center, we worked with artists and we create site-specific work. And when the actual building was torn down, we created a case against the city council, and we managed to win actually 25,000 euros in damage against artworks. So definitely art has also this this kind of legalized role within the occupied spaces. Like it helps, enhances, and depending on who the artist also is, it's very important to have that type of engagement. But the anonymity, I think, is given. It's becoming less and less an issue today with new technologies and with different a lot of the spaces have their own Facebook pages, they have their own websites, and it's easy to get information on who's behind them. And I think that there's been a lot of change in the last couple of years. But in the interesting thing is that there's a whole world behind those names, like Angelo Mai, Porto Fluviale, Forte Prenestino, of relationships, social relationships that individuals and collectives also have, not only between themselves, but with the institutions and the public entities of the city. And the city of Rome has collaborated with Forte Prenestino for years on different kinds of projects that go from festivals of art to festivals of music or poetry. And the region financed the Cinema America and the whole program of the Cinema America in at the square in San Cosimato in Trastevere. So it's I mean, I can go on and on with different kind of examples of collaboration that not only the city but also the region initiated with these types of spaces. So I wouldn't speak of anonymity as much as collectivity or the use of these collective names that then behind those names, people, there's a world of relationships, institutional relationships that actually manage to bring forth the political work and keep the spaces instead of having them evicted. And for example, the Cinema Palazzo was evicted just last week, and there was a trial against the occupiers, and one of the occupiers was Sabina Guzzanti, who is a very important comedian, and she was behind the Cinema Palazzo. And they were all let out of bail and free of charge, and the city decided to give the space back to the Cinema Palazzo after evicting it. So I mean, once you get into this world, you have to kind of make it's really hard to make. We're trying. I think the research that I will be doing will be looking into these specific cases and trying to figure out this nuanced relationship of institutionalization and collectivity rather than anonymity.
If I can only briefly sort of add to what Arya said, I kind of connect anonymity and your comments about anonymity to the question that has kept us busy in the group quite a lot recently, which is the kind of the performances of agency and who are the agents in our projects, also in relation to the sort of traditional kind of artist agency and an authorship. So traditionally, the subject of art history is the single genius artist, usually again a white man. But actually, we have been discussing a lot about the relationship between individual and collective agency in our projects, and in this kind of projects, we are still in the middle of our discussions. But certainly, and this is in a way is also an answer to a partial answer to the question of space, we do focus on microtopias and collectives. I'm personally not so interested in the individual artist. I was reading recently a project similar to ours, which was very focused on sort of the, in a way, the traditional artist subjectivity. So the, whatever, Jonas Stahl, for example, who is the artist who enables other people agency. And I read your comments about anonymity as part of this sort of, sort of one of the practices of this form of creative institutionalism, where it is really not about, where agency in the sense of Castoriadis happens between the individual and the collective. And so even if it's that particular sort of operation is done by a specific person, in fact, the agency is a collective one, and it's sort of negotiated in between the two.
Thank you. And I'm very sorry, but I look at the time, at the clock, and I think we have run out of time. So thank you again. I can only thank you again, Chiara and Aria, for your great talk. Your presentation definitely triggered our curiosity. I'm very sorry for those who have posed other questions, but I think we have really to close now.
Can you send them to me?
Yes, exactly.
Please, can you send them to us? The ones in the chat and the other ones. That would be lovely. And I thank you so much for the questions and the engagement.
Thank you.
I'm very happy.
And I hope we can do a follow up if you have new information about the project. Maybe you can come again to talk about this great project. So thank you very much.
Otherwise, NVO is gonna give me, lots of troubles.
I have no doubt that will be a great project. So thank you again, Chiara and Aria, and thank you to all of you for the question, for joining us this evening. And may I invite you to join us for the next KNIR Research Dialogue. Please check on our website for an update of the program. And as last word, I can only say, arrivederci.
Thank you very much for attending and for engaging with the project in such an interesting way. And yeah.
It was great.
Hope to see you all sometime soon in person.
I hope so. I hope the same. Bye-bye. Thank you. Arrivederci.